Anyone who's involved in the Propor Integrity Project is going to hear a lot about charters. So, what's a charter? Well, a charter is nothing more than a document. Okay, these days possibly a website. It contains written but not legally enforceable promises. These promises have been made by key role players in any specific joint undertaking intended to accomplish something to a certain clearly established standard. It's intended to clarify the expectations of what ought to be accomplished and how it should be accomplished so that everyone who has a stake in this accomplishment will know what to expect and who to hold accountable. Within this Propor Integrity Project, one of the most important tools is just such a charter, the Service Integrity Charter. And the accomplishment, of course, is integrity in service delivery, particularly the provision of water and sanitation services. In some ways, a Service Integrity Charter is a very new tool to use, but in other ways this application is well tested and well established. In the last 2 decades, the public sector has taken notice of successes and management techniques common in the private sector, and as a result, many market-based assumptions have found their way into the theory and practice of public governance all over the world. For this reason, the emphasis has been moving more and more towards improving government efficiency and effectiveness in service delivery, and also on improving government responsiveness to clients or customers in terms of the quality of the delivery of services, all with greater promptness, courtesy, transparency, and professionalism, all of which, of course, are integrity issues. The PPI's Service Integrity Charter is an outgrowth of this recent history. As such, it is part of a global process that many people trace back to Great Britain in the early 1990s, with the creation at that time of service charters, sometimes referred to as citizens' charters or public service charters. The objective of any charter of this kind is to give priority to the users of government services, citizens, and to establish a consensus on the appropriate standards needed to make the public service transparent, effective, affordable, and accessible, while simultaneously reducing the bureaucracy, red tape, corruption, and delay that so often are part of public service delivery. These charters accomplish this by making the governments concerned more accountable to their constituents and, using private sector term, their customers. Charters provide all of the information that customers typically find helpful and necessary, and they go some distance in making public sector service providers much more responsive to customers' needs. In some countries, governments were motivated to adopt such charters in response to the pressure of demands and grievances from customers of their services. These charters were seen as a way to clarify the reasonable expectations customers ought to have regarding those services, or even formally to guarantee certain customer rights. Since its start in Britain, the British model of a service charter has been adopted with varying refinements in many developed and developing countries, including Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Canada, France, India, Italy, Malaysia, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, South Africa, and in some states within the United States. In these places, the main components of such charters generally include a specific set of statements embracing, first, what standards or qualities of services ought reasonably to be expected, and what performance. Second, what indicators would be used to evaluate service delivery. Third, who is responsible for the service provision, often including actual contact details. And last, what mechanisms or procedures are available to express customers' grievances or complaints. Well, the PPI is not using a service charter, a citizens charter, or a public service charter. Instead, we're using a service integrity charter. The word integrity is important. This is a new model that we've developed. It builds on the very best elements of service charters, citizens charters, or public service charters. But it also tries to resolve some important weaknesses of these older forms. We've put integrity into the charter to bring back some needed focus. Many people who have had experience with the other types of service charters complain that these charters place excessive reliance on market-oriented values such as efficiency, while underplaying or ignoring service quality, accessibility, and accountability. Of even greater concern, this shift to the market, some argue, has undermined traditional public service ethics, creating less, not more, trust in local governments. Still others were concerned that something quite important is lost when citizens become customers. The provision of public services becomes just another commercial transaction and not the fulfillment of the citizens' trust in their government to use the public resources properly. Finally, as was particularly seen in the case of India, the old model of service charter has proven to work well for the wealthy and powerful users of public services, but it has proven far less able to ensure access to services for the majority of people who suffer from various forms of social exclusion based on economic or social class or caste. So, we put integrity into the Charter for the same reason that this project is the Pro-Poor Integrity Project, to fight against exclusion of the disadvantaged, and to make sure that this form of charter reflects a broad base of participation, support, and ownership. The Service Integrity Charter therefore combines the most important elements of integrity and good governance. We're not at all shy about borrowing what works well from the private sector, yet at the same time we're not willing to sacrifice the central role of trust building in local governance. Okay, what's the PPI's Service Integrity Charter do? What makes it distinctive? Well, first, it promotes the empowerment of citizens by raising their critical awareness of the quality of the services, their rights to such services, and what an appropriate set of expectations about those services ought to consist of. A Service Integrity Charter also reflects their common desire to get the best possible value for taxpayers' money. Among its many other important characteristics are, first, trust. The Service Integrity Charter is fundamentally about the trust relationship between citizens and service providers, demonstrated through measurable outcomes in alignment, competence, and ethical behavior, without excluding the poor and disadvantaged. Second, it's about standard setting. In general, the content of any specific traditional service charter is determined by the local government as the service providers, or at least the local government as the coordinator of non-governmental service providers. In the case of the PPI, however, the standards for these service integrity charters will be identified and agreed upon through a joint working group process that ensures a stronger partnership between key stakeholders, including, but not necessarily limited, to local government and local civil society organizations. There will be a lot of open discussion and deliberation between those concerned in the joint working group, but there is no formal negotiation process involved in setting these standards. This isn't intended as a competition between powerful opposing interests. The joint working groups may even choose to survey consumers' attitudes and preferences, but this survey would not be a charter requirement. The third characteristic is informality. Service integrity charters are not pieces of legislation. They're drafted in general and informal terms, usually not by lawyers. They aren't even thought of as enforceable laws. Instead, they're very public promises, driven by the risk of loss of face or reputation. Those who sign the Service Integrity Charter put their personal reputations on the line, and the reputations of the institutions that they represent. Failure to perform, while possibly subject to legal recourse outside the context of the Service Integrity Charter, is constrained mostly by this charter's peer group pressure and its sense of mutual accountability. Finally, in terms of characteristics, monitoring and enforcement is important. While Service Integrity Charters themselves are not enforceable contracts, we do look for two kinds of monitoring to occur. First, we expect that the local governments themselves will establish mechanisms to keep track of their own performance. Second, we look to civil society partners to monitor both the technical performance and the integrity of service provision. But perhaps I'm getting a little ahead of myself. We may be mixing apples with oranges, as every country is different when it comes to the role or mandate of the local governments regarding service delivery. Let's take a look at a diagram describing two of the most common models of how local governments function. This is Model 1. In this model, which is common to local governments in many African countries and beyond, the local government currently is one of a number of different service providers. It doesn't have a central role. It just provides a certain mandated range of services alongside such other service providers as the central government's various ministries, certain civil society organizations, or even the private sector. For places where local governments have very limited budgets and staff, this is a simple solution. Unfortunately, though, with this model, there isn't anyone who has the responsibility to look after or regulate the whole range of services that local citizens receive. This results almost always in certain gaps in the quality, distribution, or types of services available. It also makes it very complicated for the local citizens to know who to turn to. Finally, under this arrangement, the poor and the disadvantaged are frequently poorly served or not served at all, since there's no one in any powerful position who can advocate for them. But there is a different model. In this model, Model 2, which is seen commonly in South Africa and in many European countries and in the United States, we find a model that differs from the earlier one because local government is on top. This doesn't mean that local governments provide all of the services themselves, but it does mean that local governments facilitate a visioning process that paints a picture of the quality and scope of public services available to all, both now and within the next few years. For example, up until the year 2029. Once local citizens have a clear vision of their desired future growth and development, it's the responsibility of all service providers to be responsive to that vision statement. Local government, too, must provide its mandated services in response to that vision statement, and ideally the local government grows to become the advocate for the citizens, communicating on their behalf to all of the other service providers to ensure that the vision statement is honored. In some instances, local governments are even empowered to regulate the services that others provide. In this model, local governments preside over, which means facilitate, not dominate, the vision statement process. In so doing, they come to know firsthand what their citizens need and want. If the local government has the capacity, they take the primary responsibility to see the vision statement through to achieve the goals that it contains. Among these goals, or instrumental to these goals, is the provision of services. The Service Integrity Charter helps local governments to keep up the standards when it comes to service delivery, especially the integrity considerations. But how do we begin? How do we create a Service Integrity Charter? What sort of challenges will our Service Integrity Charter have to address? First, let's start by distinguishing service levels from service integrity. Both levels and integrity describe something about the service that will be provided, and both are measurable. A service level tells us about the quantity, quality, and cost of the service. For example, if you want to get water provided to your property, and the local government has the mandate to provide and distribute water, then the local government should be able to tell you what level of services they can provide. This level of service description will describe the water quality, whether it's potable or not, the quantity available, for instance, what diameter access pipe you can have at what water pressure, and how long it will take to get connected to their distribution pipes, assuming they're accessible from your property, and of course what the cost will be, usually based on the quantity used. Service integrity, by comparison, also describes quality, but in a different context. These characteristics of quality aren't often stated in explicit terms outside a Service Integrity Charter. They cover the relationship between the service provider and the service user. For example, is the service provided with courtesy? Is the service provider attentive and helpful? Is the service once received what it was promised to be? Do the service provider's staff seek